Good morning, dolls, and welcome to Little Gretchen's workshop. So, dolls, today I will be measuring. I'm actually making a small cabinet for the area right above the pantry work table. So I measured the area that I have available, which is roughly 5 inches before I get to the little shelf that I made in a previous video. So I didn't want the cabinet to come all the way over to where that little shelf was. So I made my shelf 4.5 inches across. So here, dolls, I marked my wood with a pencil so I would know where to score it before I begin to try to cut. And here, dolls, I used my speed square to define and make sure where I was going to cut is level. Now, dolls, if you look really closely, you can see that my blade is pretty dull looking from some previous projects. Actually, this blade is pretty dull, so I'm having some difficulty cutting my wood. And you see how it cut kind of jagged? That's because my blade was not sharp. So now I've changed the blade. I have a brand new blade, and watch how nice and smooth it cuts. I mean, barely touching the wood. It just went through it like butter. So always start with a fresh blade at the beginning of your wood project, dolls. It makes things so much simpler. And I actually need to trim off that jagged edge on my remnant piece so that when I start my next project, I won't have to do that. And I'm just going across it very gently, and it gives a nice clean cut. Yeah, a new blade makes a big difference. Now here I want to show you a cabinet that I was actually considering in the space before I decided to make the cabinet that I'm making in this video. It's a really nice shelf, but I actually feel like it's more of a decorative shelf. I really liked the design and the style of it, but I decided to use it inside the rooming house cafe. So I will utilize it, but I just won't use it in the pantry space. But in my mind, my design, I would like it to have doors, and I would like it to have two sets of two shelves. And I'll show you what I mean, dolls. So I was just looking at the size, I was looking at the shape and the depth of the cabinet. Now, although I've already decided how wide I want it to be, I don't want it to be really deep because I don't want it to block the view to the utility room door. So here, dolls, I'm just comparing the jumbo craft stick depth to the side of the existing cabinet, and it's roughly the same minus the scallop design on the existing cabinet. So I am going to use the jumbo craft stick as the sides of my cabinet. So here you see me just testing to see if the depth of that jumbo craft stick is deep enough for me to put the items that I plan on putting on the shelves. And they definitely are. And I even have enough room to add a lip to the edge of the jumbo craft stick to ensure the items don't fall off. So those are the kind of little things you need to consider when you're making your custom dollhouse furniture. You want to make sure that it serves the purpose that you're designing it for. So dolls, here's a quick sketch of what my idea was, just so you can kind of have an idea of what I want it to look like. So let's move on to all the rest of the materials. So I'm kind of looking at how I want to do the shelves. And as you saw in the picture, oh, I'm not sure if you could see well, but in the picture, I wanted to do 2 shelves, which would give me 3 spaces to put items. And I'm going to use the jumbo craft sticks for both of the sides, both of the shelves, and the top and bottom. And I did grab me a couple coffee stir sticks because I'm going to use those as my decorative pieces. So I just wanted everything to be out as I worked. So here you see me measuring and sizing up the bottom of the cabinet with the jumbo craft sticks, so I know where I'll need to cut. And I am using my easy cutter to save my wrist because you know the wood on jumbo craft sticks to me is a little bit stiffer and harder to cut than just cutting basswood or balsa. So just keep that in mind, dolls. To me, it's really tough trying to cut through jumbo craft sticks with a just a craft knife or even a saw blade. It's a little tough, so I would definitely recommend using an easy cutter to cut jumbo craft sticks and popsicle sticks. Okay, so I had to cut 4 top and bottom, both of the sides, and I also needed 2 to be my shelves. So if you do 2 shelves, you have 3 spaces to actually put items. And I sped up this part because this is just basically we're making a box. Think of it as just making a simple box. Now I am using my 1, 2, 3 blocks to support my side as I glue things together. And I've already squeezed my glue out. Now, dolls, although I cut my jumbo craft sticks pretty straight with the Easy Cutter, there's little jagged edges there. So I would recommend that you sand off those little burrs on the ends of the jumbo craft sticks before you start to glue. And make sure that when you glue it down, you're gluing the piece of wood on top of the back of your cabinet base. Now, I hope you dolls can see I'm using my little granite chunks and the 1, 2, 3 blocks to support my pieces while the glue is setting up. When you're gluing pieces like this, the wood is very thin, so that little lip or edge that you're using is really thin, and it's difficult to hold it in place while it's setting. So if you have a chunk of granite or your 1, 2, 3 blocks, it's really convenient to use that to support your piece while the glue is setting up. After it sets up, it'll be a breeze to add the rest. And here I'm adding the second piece, which is the other side to the cabinet, and I'm using that chunk of granite to support me while I put that piece in place. And again, note that I'm sitting it on top of the back of the cabinet base. Now, dolls, I did have a little glue ooze out, but I just took my toothpick and just ran it along there really gently to scoop out that extra, and that helps it from spreading if you try to wipe it. If you just get it out with that little toothpick, it does a really neat job. So here we're moving on to the top and bottom pieces, which are your pieces that you already cut out. Now, I did cut them almost the same length as the other ones, but they're definitely going to have to be shortened because these 2 pieces are going to have to sit on top of the base in between the 2 side pieces. So if you've cut it too long, you're definitely going to have to trim it off. And you're only going to have to trim off a little bit, so be very conscious of how much you trim off. Right here, if you look very closely, you can see that really, really thin little edge that's going to need to be trimmed off of that corner. So you definitely can do that with your Easy Cutter, but don't overcut it because you need it to fit in between those 2 side pieces. So here I am trimming off that little teeny weeny little bit and just testing it, dry fitting it into the space, and you see it goes in between the 2 side pieces of the shelf. So that's the bottom piece or the top piece, depending on how you're looking at it. So I'm doing the last fit of that piece before I actually go ahead and add the glue. I sanded it a little bit, and you see how it sits really neatly in between those 2 pieces. And that's the second piece. I'm just checking it to see if it's about the same size, so I'll know how much more I want to trim it as well. So now that top piece has been trimmed and sanded, and I'm just setting it in place on top of the back of the cabinet. And then I'll go on to the other side, and it has been trimmed and sanded as well. It fits very neatly, and it's ready to be glued in. Now, dolls, although this process seems very simple, it is kind of a long process. So I want you to take breaks if you need to in the process, like while you're waiting for the box to dry. Take a break, get some water, walk away for a moment. Don't get frustrated if you run into some kinks or some hindrances. Just take your time and work through it. Now, I've gotten to this point, and I'm actually adding the glue to the bottom and the sides, but just know that I did take a couple phone breaks in between this. I didn't work straight through this process. So be kind to yourself while you're working and while you're learning to build furniture and components for your dollhouse. So now that it's glued on top of my piece, I'm going to support it with my little 1, 2, 3 block to keep it from falling over or falling in. Now, dolls, if you don't have 1, 2, 3 blocks, or chunks of granite laying around, you can definitely use an old book or a block of wood or an old box that you're not using anymore. Use what you have. Sometimes you have to improvise, but don't stop creating because you don't have all the popular tools. So here I'm gluing in that second piece. It fits really nicely. Again, I'm sitting it on top of the base and putting the block there to support it and make sure it's creating pressure so those corners will be nice and square. Now I'm going to add a couple pieces of wood around the perimeter of the box to create like a small lip. I like my shelves to have kind of a lip on them to keep things from falling out, and there'll be an additional support for when I add the door hinges. So I'm just measuring out the part of the wood stick to go on the perimeter of the cabinet. After I measured and chose the pieces I wanted, I cut it with my saw blade to the length of that side. And I'm going to take that wood stick all the way around the complete perimeter of the front of the cabinet. Now at this point, dolls, I started to think about the shelving for the little cabinet. And I wanted to try some of my items to see how they would fit and how much room I would have or would need for each shelf. Still working with the jumbo craft sticks, I determined how big or how short I would need to cut them to make them fit in between the sides of the cabinet walls. Now, as I mentioned before, dolls, 2 shelves will create 3 spaces to store food items. So again, I used my food items to determine how big or how high I needed the shelves to be on each level and marked it on the side pieces of the shelf. And I actually used some of my larger pieces to determine how much space I needed so I won't be hindered in my setup of the cabinet. So I'll be able to use large food items and small food items if I use a big item or big jar as my template. So here I am dry fitting the first shelf, and then I actually used, like I said, a couple Lego blocks to help me because again, I'm trying to create 3 spaces. So I trimmed off another jumbo craft stick and again left that little Lego there and the jar that I was intending to use. So it would give me a realistic idea of how big the items would be that I could put on each shelf. No, dolls, although this seems a little bit tedious, these are the type of things you have to think about when you're creating a piece for your dollhouse, because the last thing you want to do is to create something lovely that you can't put anything in. That would be very, very frustrating. Ask me how I know. So here, dolls, I've stacked a few of my Lego lookalikes together so they'll help me keep my spacing on my shelves. And I do want you dolls to know that these are not the collectible Legos. These are Lego lookalikes. I actually purchased them from my local dollar store. So yeah, dolls, grab you a couple bags. You know, don't use your collectible Legos. Use the lookalikes. They come in really handy. Plus, you won't feel bad that you disrespected genuine, authentic Lego pieces. And here I am adding glue to the sides and the back of my first shelf. And I'm adding it very sparingly. The Gorilla Wood glue holds really good. You just need enough to make contact with your surface. And I'm adding it in and using my Lego lookalikes to support my piece while it dries and the glue sets up. And I went ahead and added glue to the second shelf and actually supported it with that second set of Lego lookalike pieces so that it could dry and the glue could set up for it as well. And I actually used a little shelf from another project to create tension to keep everything level while it dries. So let's leave that alone for a bit. So here, dolls, the shelves are dry and I actually have already glued the wood square sticks around the perimeter of the shelves. So I'm actually allowing that to dry and you see I have the blue tape on them. Now here I'm using 2 more of the square sticks to make dividers for the doors for my shelf. And I'm marking where I need to cut the thin wood square sticks. One day I'm going to pre-cut all my pieces before I start my dollhouse furniture project, but I'm not there yet, dolls. So here I'm just showing you where I made my pencil marks. It's pretty faint, but you can see where I've decided to glue those small square sticks. And I want it to fit really taut because that's where my doors are going to close next to these wood sticks. It's actually going to create like just a visual divider, so I'll know how wide I need to actually make the doors. Preparing to add the doors is always my favorite part. So I'm adding the partitions for the doors. So I'm trying to space out where I actually want the doors to be and positioning them so that when I put the doors on or add the hinges, it'll open and close easily. Now those thin square strips are not just partitions, but they're actually a part of the structure of the cabinet. And I will put what I call a door stop on the inside of that bar. But let me kind of shape things up. I sanded a little bit on the outside to smooth out some of the burrs. And no matter how perfect and accurate your measurements and cuts are, there'll always be something to sand. And as much as I hate to admit it, sanding is a key part to making beautiful miniatures. Now, dolls, in this frame, I've already added the two end doors, and I've added the coffee stir stick behind the partition. So I installed the doors using the pin hinge technique like I used on the pantry cabinet door. Now, if you haven't seen that video, definitely check it out in my playlist. Now I'm still using two of the same square sticks, and then I'm using two really thin coffee stir sticks. And I'm putting the partitions in to keep things in place. The doors have already been added, and I'm just sanding a little bit. And after I've sanded to make sure the partitions fit, I'm putting the bars for the doors inside the space because I want to make sure that the doors aren't too big or too small to fit. And then I'm adding the header bar on the outside of the door. Now you'll be able to see shortly when that's dry, but while that's drying, let me look at the glass. Now when it comes to glass dolls, I always use the flexible glass. And by flexible glass, I do mean the acetate. It's the packaging plastic you get when you buy croissants at the big box stores, or sometimes it comes in packaging for toys or other items, but it's just the clear plastic. I love it when it comes from the big box stores because the pieces are big and the sheets are really, really wide, so they work out really good for multiple projects. So dolls, before I fit the glass for the doors of the cabinet, I just want to show you some things about the structure of the door. Now, although I only used a small piece of stir stick as the header, I do add a supporting piece, which is the same wood that I use the sidebars of the door. And I put that behind the header piece as a structural support. Because you have to think, dolls, I do want to be able to open and close these doors, so they need to have a certain level of stability and strength. And this wood stick alone is not enough. Now, with the coffee stir stick on top of it and the other piece behind it, it makes it structurally more sturdy, and it really makes it look really pretty because the stir stick covers up or finishes the top of the wood stick. The wood stick looks kind of crude. The coffee stir stick is actually a little bit smoother and has a nicer finish to it. And you'll be able to see what I mean in a moment, dolls. So now I'm adding the door in just to make sure it fit, because sometimes when you're designing things, you can throw things a little off. So you always want to keep checking to make sure it still fits in your space neatly. Now I'm hoping from this angle you dolls can see a little bit better how there's the wood stick, but I'm about to add the really thin coffee stir stick just to the top of that, and I'm going to lay it flush. It's not going to be out on the outer rim. I'm going to push it more toward the middle, and it'll actually create a lip for the inside of the door for me to place my flexible glass. Now my hand is in the way here, but you'll be able to see shortly, dolls. I'm just adding a little glue to the stick, and you see how I'm laying it on top of the wood piece and pushing it toward the center of the door. Now I'm going to hold it here at the angle, and I'm going to slow the camera down a little bit so you can see. That's the wood stick, but I'm about to add the coffee stir stick on the top of that as, like I say, a veneer, because it's really, really thin, and it'll give more stability to that stick so it can withstand all the activity in the busy rooming house kitchen. And you lay it really, really close, and you're only going to put a very small sparing amount of glue on that because you don't want it to ooze, and you definitely don't want it to be thick and glunky on side the inner lip, because that'll make it difficult to install your flexible glass. Now, dolls, because the wood strip or the coffee stir stick is really thin, I actually clamped it to make sure it doesn't bend or bow while it's drying. Now, keep in mind, dolls, these are the really super, super thin coffee stir sticks. These aren't the thicker, heavier ones that I used on the pantry cabinet. Now, I actually purchased both of these on Amazon, but the thinner ones, you get way more in the packet, and they're a lot less expensive because they're super, super thin, almost to the degree of flimsy. But sometimes flimsy works in miniature. And dolls, I really want you to look at the design of the door. So this last piece of veneer or coffee stir stick is acting with a dual purpose. So not only is it adding stability and sturdiness to the doors, it actually makes it look more streamlined and finished, because again, the wood stick looks kind of plain and rugged. This makes it look a little bit more finished. Even though I'm going to distress the cabinet, it gives it a cleaner look. So in this frame, I've already added the coffee stir sticks all around the perimeter of that door, and I've clamped it with some big paper clamps to make sure it dries nice and flat. So let's give that a moment to dry while I look over here and consider the windows that are already attached. And I sped this up a little bit, dolls, because I'm actually just repeating the same process all around the doors that are already installed, and completing the edges of the door that was drying. And again, dolls, after you've constructed your doors and they're nice and dry and feeling really firm and sturdy, you will need to just sand them just a little bit. You know, as much as I hate sanding, again, I say it's inevitable when you're making miniatures, especially when you're making furniture, because you want a nice smooth finish. And you see I added a little putty to those little corners where there were slight gaps in between the coffee stir sticks. So now let's get to the fun part, which would be adding the flexible glass. And again, dolls, these pieces of glass are not pre-cut. I'm cutting them as I go. And if you can kind of see while I'm holding it on the inside, because of the way I laid the coffee stir stick, it gives a nice little area for your flexible glass to rest. Now I'm definitely going to add glue to that, but I'm not going to do that till after I finish my piece. And I really like the way that fit is. It looks really, really nice. And I do have to sand up and clean up those corners where I added the putty. But that's just to fill in the gaps. But wait until it's absolutely solid and dry before you sand it. Be very gentle, and it would be best to remove your glass before you start sanding. And here we are, dolls, with a finished cabinet. Now, I really like the way the cabinet looks. The structure is nice and solid. My doors close nicely. I'm very pleased with them. Now, I definitely have to finish it, and I need to add some doorknobs and the glass. But before we do that, we actually have to add a hinge to that middle door. Now here I'm just assessing my piece and trying to determine whether I want to add the hinge on the left side or the right side of the door, which will mean the door on the end and the middle door will face each other. And dolls, I literally eyeballed the center of that square wood stick to find the point where I would just press and create like a pre-drill hole for my pin hinge. Now this wood is a little bit softer than some of the other woods I've used. It's very thin, it's a lot smaller. And so I'm just using a straight dress pen to make an indentation, again, sort of like a pre-drill hole. And I'm actually going to use some thin brass pins to make the hinge for this door. Again, the cabinet is smaller, the wood is thinner, and the wood for the doors is thinner and softer. So I really don't have to do a full drill to get a hole for my hinge. Now here I'm gently sanding a rounded edge on one side of the door, which would be the side of the door that you intend to install the pin hinge. Dolls, this is absolutely necessary, or it will be difficult to impossible to open your door if you don't round off that edge. Again, ask me how I know. And I would say in this process, your main objective would be to take that squared off corner. If you can do that, you should be good. Now, dolls, I know it's really tiny, but I have a tiny brass pin in my hand, and I'm just going to cut it in half, and I'm going to use one half on one end of the door, and then snip off that tip, and then use the other half in the other end of the door. Now, dolls, although I'm using these tiny brass pins, a regular dressmaking pin will work just as well. Just make sure you have some good wire cutters to snip it off on the end. So here I am. I've added a little glue to that pin, and I'm taking my wire cutters and not cutting. I'm using it to bear down on the pin and press it into the wood. Now be very careful, dolls. Be careful of your fingers. You don't want it to slip and the pin come through and poke you in the fingers. You know, as miniaturist dolls, our hands are very precious to us. So always be careful with your hands and be careful with your tools. And from this angle, dolls, you can see that I pressed the pin all the way down into the piece of wood, and now all I have to do is snip off the top. So I'm going to pull it out because I'm going to reinsert it from the bottom of the cabinet. So here, dolls, I was having a little bit of difficulty with my wire cutters. At this point, they're essentially some makeshift pliers or vice grips because they really wouldn't cut the tip of that pin off. So I had to get my electrical scissors to cut the tip off. Now it's ready to be inserted into the cabinet base. But first, I do need to make a pre-hole in the door area of the cabinet. So I used the large dressmaking pin again and pressed in with a little pressure. Always be careful about your fingers, dolls. And after I did that, I pulled the pin out so I could insert the top pin first in its place. After the door is installed, I push the pin from the bottom to lock the door in. So if you can watch as I do this, dolls. Now, I don't do a lot of measuring when it comes to the pin areas. I do eyeball it quite a bit. And you can see here, I decided to change the sides where I wanted the pin hinge to be. And I'm just making an indentation so that when I press the pin in, it'll just follow along where the impression of the pin is. And watch here where I'm pressing it in at the top. Just gently, very firmly, the top portion pin is going through the wood. Now, if you can see there. So, dolls, I slowed the video down in this portion so you can see the pin actually going into the wood. And, dolls, after that first pin is in, your door is halfway installed. So at this point, dolls, you should be able to kind of see an invisible line as to where the next pin should be. And when I say an invisible line, you'll just see how the doors are lining up and you'll have an idea of where to make your impression. Now I'm going to make a slight impression at the top of the cabinet or the bottom, whichever way you're holding it. And I'm making the impression in the wood with my dressmaking pen, pressing it hard enough to make a deep impression for the pin. Start the brass pin right where I made my impression. I took my pliers and just began to press really firmly with my door closed absolutely where I wanted to sit, and I was testing it little by little to see if it was still open, checking to see if it was lining up and going in where I wanted it. And there you go. The door is all installed, dolls. It closes nice and neat, and we're ready to add knobs and glass. I'm really pleased at the way this cabinet turned out, dolls. Now we're going to add some very simple knobs made from simple straight pins, dolls. Now, I'd originally considered using my dressmaking pins that have the big colorful balls on the end, but when I tried them on the cabinet, they looked a little out of scale to me. So again, I opted for the little brass pins. Although I like the brass pins, the heads of the pins seemed a little small. So I went ahead and made the impressions for my handles with the straight pen. And actually, when I was making the impressions, the pen went straight through. So this portion of my wood definitely was a lot softer. So after making the little holes, I pressed in the little straight pins and then came back and added my brass pins. And if you're wondering how my brass pins turned silver, I added a nail art stud to the end of the brass pin to make it a little bigger and to make it look silver. Now you definitely could have used just regular straight pin dowels as the handles for your cabinet or any number of other things. Allow your imagination to lead you. Now if you've enjoyed this video today, dolls, definitely let me know in the comments. Like, definitely share and subscribe. And always look for me on Mondays and Wednesdays after 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I want to take this moment to thank each and every one of you for your outpour of support, encouragement, and love for my channel and my content. I definitely appreciate each and every one of my subscribers, and also those of you who haven't subscribed but you're watching. I appreciate you as well. Stay tuned for part 2, finishing the cabinet. And I'm looking forward to seeing you on the next episode of Little Gretchen's Workshop. Bye-bye now, dolls.